Well, I've always thought that we're standing at the earliest spot of Greenwich's history, because you come up the Thames and this is the first part of the ancient settlement site of Greenwich that you see. Greenwich was settled because of the geology here, where river gravel comes right down to the Thames, and it's a dry place, unlike all the marshlands on either side. And we know from very early documents that there was not only a grand mansion here from maybe the 10th century to the 17th century, but also a mysterious parish church about which we know nothing. So it is possible that this was the beginning of Greenwich here. The earliest records relating to Greenwich are the charters which are kept in the state archives at Ghent in Belgium, and they date from 918 AD, when King Alfred's daughter gave her lands in Lewisham and Greenwich to the monks of the Abbey of St. Peter's in Ghent. Quite why this happened is a bit of a mystery, because that early charter is known to be a forgery. It's a very strong word, let's say a copy, because I think the transaction was quite legitimate. How she acquired the lands and why she gave them, there was some strategic reason for this. Her father, of course, was a great fighter against the Vikings, and so was her husband, the Count of Flanders, Baldwin the Bald. She married him and went to live in Ghent, and when he died she gave her lands in Lewisham and Greenwich to the Abbey of St. Peter's, and there they remained for 400 years. It was an investment. It yielded income for the monks. So all they had here was two buildings, as far as we know. They had a very large building here on High Bridge, and we know what that was like in the 17th century. It was a guest house and a courthouse. So the town of Greenwich was administered from there by a steward who probably lived in Lewisham, in a little priory building in Lewisham. And so there was only one steward here to collect money, and it was his job to collect it and make sure it got back to the Abbey of St. Peter's in Ghent. And that was the situation for 400 years. But because there was only one person here, and because Ghent is a long, long way away, there were lots of people, neighbours, kings and queens, who were very interested in this site and kept nibbling away at little bits of it, especially during a period of conflict, like during the 100 Years' War, when the Crown took the Ghent lands. It confiscated them temporarily, but while it had control over them, we're pretty certain that they kept nibbling away chunks of land. And this is probably how the site that we now know as Royal Greenwich, where the old Royal Naval College is, and the park, this is probably how it came originally into the possession of the Beaufort family first of all, and then Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. It was nibbled away. But the land was always returned to Ghent when the conflicts died down, even though in a rather depleted fashion, until Henry V decided that that was it, and he just confiscated the whole of the Ghent lands, while all the alien priory lands in this country were confiscated by the Crown. And he gave most of the Greenwich lands, Greenwich and Lewisham lands, to the priory that he'd formed at Sheen, present-day Richmond. the Carthusian priory, he gave these lands to the monks there. And again, they were there from 1414, owned by a monastic house, until Henry VIII in 1530s managed to acquire all of the manor of Greenwich and take it into royal control. So all of the lands that had belonged to Ghent and then to the Carthusian priory at Sheen were now in royal hands, and so King Henry VIII was able to do what he liked with all the property in Greenwich. And from a local point of view, one of the most interesting things that he did with a local house was to refurbish it completely for the use of Anne Boleyn before their marriage. So she was conveniently placed here at Highbridge, only a 5-minute walk from Greenwich Palace. And the house that he put her in was the ancient house that had belonged to the monks at Ghent, a house called the Old House originally, and it was called the Old House in 1268. So how old was it? Maybe it was 10th century, but there was a building there on that site, maybe from the 10th century. This is in Highbridge, where the huge power station is today. This extraordinary place was there. There are no pictures of it, but we have a very full description of it in 1695, when it had 2 kitchens, 10 bedrooms. It had stables, very large stables, and it had orchards and gardens. It was the perfect guest house for visitors, and that was its main function. So we don't know what it looked like. We have a description. We don't even know when it was pulled down, but it was gone between 1695 and maybe 1699. So, and why it was pulled down, we don't know. But we do know that newish buildings were built on the site, so maybe it was part of a sort of refurbishment of East Greenwich. This East Greenwich has changed. This part of it has changed so much. It really has been a sort of tidal flow and ebb and flow, what this area has been like. It had an industrial sort of flavour to it in the very early medieval period, when there was a tidal mill over there running off the tides of the Thames. How long that was there, no one's quite sure, but it certainly wasn't there in the 14th century, because in the 14th century the monks of Ghent drew up an inventory of everything they owned in Greenwich and Lewisham, and one of the questions that they asked themselves was where are the mills, and what kind of mills are they? You know, what do we own in the way of mills in Greenwich and Lewisham? And they answered the question with they were all water mills, and they were all in Lewisham. So there was no mention of the one that was over there, the old tidal mill. So it had already gone. So the town of Greenwich was administered from here. If people had done naughty things and needed to be taken to court, their cases were heard in the courthouse on the site of the power station. But if you wanted to buy a property or transfer a property, all that kind of transaction was done in the courthouse as well. So it was a key building in Greenwich, and there wasn't another one like it on the western side of Greenwich. So this was the hub here. And in the 14th century, there's a description of the courthouse, and it said it's the first building you see when you come up the Thames at Greenwich from Flanders. And it was very similar in the 14th century to what was described in the 17th century. So this was, as I said, it was the hub, and somewhere there was a church. I think it may have been on what later became the Royal Palace site, because some burials, medieval burials, were excavated there just 4 or 5 years ago. So we could say that this is the beginning of Greenwich. It's a very, very historic site indeed, and historic and often very difficult to interpret. The manor of Greenwich had come into the hands of the Crown, and as we know, there was a wonderful Tudor palace at Greenwich, the birthplace of Queen Elizabeth I, Mary Tudor, and it was a favourite palace of the Tudors for all sorts of very good practical reasons, and always had been a very good place for entertaining foreign visitors, again for quite clear, obvious and practical reasons, because they were all becoming up the Thames, so you could entertain them and have your diplomatic negotiations with them in the royal palace at Greenwich. But the Stuarts really lost interest in Greenwich, even though of course the Queen's house was built there in the early 17th century, and the Tudor palace fell into dereliction and was eventually demolished, and Charles II was going to build a new palace which would have had very much a diplomatic focus to it, a palace for entertaining foreign dignitaries. But that never happened because it was too costly, and so it was abandoned, and the only building that came from his plan, the King Charles block, had no roof on it in the time of Samuel Pepys, so the whole thing was a bit of a shambles. But in the 17th century, what we could probably call the domain lands of the manor of Greenwich, and domain lands were usually the sort of home farm and the adjacent lands around it. Those domain lands were acquired by the Boorman family. William Boorman supervised the laying out of Greenwich Park in the 1660s, and those domain lands, the manor of Old Court, was then sold on to Sir John Morden and Lady Morden, and they became the sort of endowment of the charity called Morden College. Morden College was founded in 1695, and it still exists on the other side of Blackheath, and was founded as a charity to look after what was described at the time as decayed Turkey merchants, meaning merchants of the Turkey Company. But basically it was people who'd lost their money gambling in the City of London. I mean gambling in the sense of being entrepreneurs and losing their money. So all of the land around here, or most of it, was now the property of a major charity. And of course they, over the centuries, have always wanted to enhance the income for Morden College, and so this has resulted in all sorts of interesting changes along here. Because going back a bit, Highbridge was a very smart area indeed in the time of the Tudor Palace, because we have major royal officials living there. These were their Greenwich townhouses, were along Highbridge. But all that began to change once the palace had gone, and once Morden College was in charge and was sort of refashioning what was going on here. And the hint of the future was really the entry onto the East Greenwich stage of the great ironmaster Ambrose Crowley. He acquired a wonderful Jacobean building, again on the site of Greenwich Power Station, which had been started by Sir Andrew Cogan, who was a remarkable maverick member of the East India Company. The East India Company seemed to have no control over him whatsoever, and he had to he was a royalist, so he had to flee this country anyway, but he started a great mansion, and it was in Cogan's time that the fantastic interior of Crowley House was formed, and there are pictures of that remarkable first floor. I shouldn't call it a sitting room, but it's where they used to sit and look out over the river, and remarkable staircases. It was very grand indeed, a quadrangular house. This was bought by this great ironmaster Ambrose Crowley in 1704, and he sort of filled in the quadrangle and made the house much bigger, many more rooms. So it looked, and refurbished it, so it looked very grand indeed. So grand that often people thought it was a remnant of the old Tudor palace, which it wasn't, because it was Jacobean in style. But being a very good hands-on businessman, adjoining his wonderful Jacobean house, he built a huge warehouse, massive. This was his main iron products distribution warehouse. It had been in Thames Street in London, but the site was too small for him because he was the major distributor and seller of iron goods, a very considerable man indeed. So he moved his warehouse, built a brand new one, and it was enormous, adjoining his house, so I suppose he could keep an eye on it. And that was really the change. This was the beginning of a new era for the riverfront here, because it went from being the smart area where courtiers lived and where this wonderful courthouse and guest house of the Abbey of Ghent, it went from that sort of environment to industrial, riverside industrial development, and it was really controlled by Magdalen College, because they wanted to enhance and increase the income for their charity. So, apart from Trinity Hospital, which was built in 1614, the surroundings became increasingly industrial. Slowly at first, because when Crowley's house was here and his warehouse, the other houses around were still quite grand. And there appeared to be only one house at Ballast Quay, and that was Thames Cottage, which we think we have an image of. And it does look, it's not large, but it does appear to have had a gazebo, so to enjoy these wonderful views up and down the Thames. But it was the beginning of a change that really accelerated and overwhelmed the whole area in the latter part of the 19th century, when the Greenwich Peninsula, which adjoins here, we're right on the edge of the River Gravels here, almost adjoining the alluvial peninsula. That was all grazing land, rich, valuable grazing land, much in demand, but by the end of the 19th century had been totally overwhelmed by not only industrial development, but because of its isolation, noxious development. Anything that stank was explosive, was a danger to life and limb, was put out there on the peninsula. So it was the beginning of, those of us who've lived in Greenwich a long time, the beginning of the Greenwich smells, which were so characteristic of the place a long, long time ago. I'm sure we all remember. People had various ways of describing them. So, this was how, because of Magdalen College, this was how this area developed in a quite different way. In another characteristic of the 17th century was that there was a huge recession in London and particularly in Greenwich. And there's a document that talks about the only industry at that time, the only business left in Greenwich was ballasting ships. And the ballast came from the great pits all around Maze Hill Station, and the roads where it was loaded into carts and brought down here and loaded onto empty ships to ballast them if they were having to go back to wherever they came from with no cargo. And this was a major industry, and this is how Ballast Quay, of course, gets its name. What it was called before, we don't really know. Maybe Highbridge was an ancient name, because that's a deep water landing area for ships. But we don't really know, because there's nothing to tell us. But Ballast Quay is all about the ballast industry, and that lasted for a couple of hundred years at least. And it was very, very important and did employ a lot of people. But it would have meant that this area was not picturesque and attractive the way it is now. This would have been a rather open area with lots of carts arriving all the time, ships tied up in the river here, and then all of this ballast being shoveled down into the holds of ships day after day after day. So it sort of kept Greenwich alive. Ballast Quay began to develop, and at some point these houses were built. I mean, we've always thought these were the houses behind me were very early 19th century, but it almost looks like they're built on a strange footprint of maybe something earlier. We know there was a large pub here called the Green Man, which was very significant, which had a big yard for carriages and wagons to go in. That pub has sort of morphed into the Cutty, well, later the Union Tavern, and now Cutty Sark pub, same building. And then again, the focus changes from ballast to the coal trade. Again, sort of a link with the northeast, because London was consuming such vast amounts of coal and colliers were arriving in huge numbers. They had to be controlled, and they were controlled from here. And Thames Cottage, where the fisherman William Bracegirdle had lived, and he's featured in Julie Tadman's wonderful book, which she's written about him and about the development of this area. He lived in a house called Thames Cottage. That was taken down by Magdalen College, and the harbour master's house was built. And this is the harbour master's wharf that we're standing on here, and he held the colliers at this point in Greenwich until there was somewhere for them to go in the further up in the Pool of London. So it became a key site for the coal trade, and adjacent was the Coles Child coke works. Out of all this industrial development came the housing, not just what's behind me, but lots of lovely little streets here which were developed. They were supervised. The development was by Coles Child, this great coal merchant over there, And the wonderful terraces in and around Pelton Road behind us here, the design was very closely monitored by George Smith, a very fine architect who happened to be clerk of the works to Magdalen College. Hence the wonderful detailing of these buildings. So it really is a fine development and much sought after. So we're now into a very industrial era indeed, and of course over there was there were wharves all the way round to the peninsula and beyond down the other side. So the whole of the peninsula and this part of East Greenwich was solid industrial development. So it became very workaday, very grimy, and many of us here will remember Robinson's scrap metal yard just there. In order to get to here, you had to walk up through a narrow passage with scrap iron piled up on either side of you, and often pieces of scrap, huge pieces, travelling over your head as you walked. But it was interesting. It was because the riverside was still working then, and of course just there was Lovell's Wharf with all of its cranes and very regular modern barges coming up from Rotterdam, bringing goods in, taking things out, all very workaday. There was a huge container terminal over there, Victoria Wharf, which is long since gone, and of course the first transatlantic telegraph cable was laid in 1866, made at Enderby Wharf, which is just over there. So it was solid industry and very, very workaday. And in what seems to be an incredibly short space of time, most of it's gone. So when I turn my head and look over there, Lovell's Wharf, cranes, nothing. The buildings I remember, nothing. And in place of cranes we've got a row of shrubs. It's all quite different. And that change is carrying on at the moment as more and more of the industrial sites disappear and just are there waiting for riverside development into smart apartments mainly. In the 1830s and 40s, when William Bracegirdle and his family were living at Thames Cottage, which was on the site of the harbour master's house, the area, the wharf area here was fairly derelict and unsafe, and there were negotiations between Bracegirdle and Magdalen College about how to deal with this. And so the line of the riverbank here was quite different. It changed at the time of William Bracegirdle, but it also happened to correspond with a rather dramatic and rather disastrous event in Greenwich's history that not many people actually know about, which was that a new port was built at Grimsby for fishermen, and subsequently a railway line to London. Now, Greenwich had a substantial fishing industry. You've only got to look in the Greenwich parish archives to see how many apprentices there were in the 18th century, and there are quite a few records of the fishermen who were based in Greenwich, and they were extraordinary people. The skippers couldn't read or write, never been to school, hadn't learned anything, but they used to go in their small fishing craft from here to the Arctic Circle and back with cargoes of fish, and survive. It was it's an extraordinary tale of sort of heroism, daily heroism. But the opening of Grimsby just killed it immediately. The Greenwich fishing families, by and large, they all left Greenwich and went to Grimsby, because the fish that were landed at Grimsby then came down by rail to London, and it was all very quick and very efficient, and there was no point being a fisherman here anymore. If you were going to be a cod fisherman, you had to go, so they all left. So that was a very significant moment in Greenwich's history. The development of housing along here is a bit of a mystery, really. We know from some extraordinary drawings that Neil Rind and myself discovered back in 2006, that we know what the new buildings were like here in 1705. We know what buildings were on High Bridge, and we can identify those, and we think we can probably identify a building behind us here as being Thames Cottage on the site of the Harbour Master's house. There's a huge, in these drawings which we've published in a book called Greenwich Revealed, there's a huge gap with nothing there, and we think that there was nothing there. And these houses behind us seem to have been built about 1804, but they're so, the ground plan and the footprint is so odd that their development was obviously governed by the presence of other things, whether they were industrial buildings or other dwellings. No one has yet managed to unravel it, so that is a job for the future. Sit down with huge mountains of Greenwich Parish rate books and just copy everything out for Ballast Quay. But even then, well, I did try myself on a small scale, but they're quite difficult to interpret. So a mystery that will be uncovered in the future, I'm sure.